Hi, Dr. Blaney here. Today I'm going to start talking about light therapy. I'd like to pose the question as to why you might consider that backlit computers, as well as LED lighting and fluorescence that we're surrounded with at the office and sometimes at home, may not be in your best interest, health-wise and longevity-wise, mood-wise and productivity-wise. I'll go into the reasons why, but in order to do that, in order to make a compelling argument that any intelligent person would honestly consider whether we might want to change our habits for our lighting that surrounds us. So I start out by laying out the grounds or the basis. And the starting point is what any scientist would do. Just as a background, I have a PhD in chemical engineering, and for the past 4 years I've been working in light therapy and the science of light and products that deliver specific frequencies of light to the body. So I have a little bit of understanding about light. So I'm going to start with the history of the Earth and how we understand currently that humans evolved in symbiosis with the Earth. So we started out single cell organisms, and then the eukaryotic cells formed little cities of cells, which then turned into multiple cell organisms, which then evolved more and turned into, as far as we know, humans, mammals and humans. So how do humans exist in the world? What makes this symbiosis possible so that there's harmony, longevity, happiness, and procreation of life? We certainly can't exist out in free space, right? Because our bodies would explode, we wouldn't have food, we wouldn't have love, and we wouldn't be happy. We can't live on the North Pole because we would need a lot of technology to survive. And all in all, it would be more trouble than it's worth. I think most people would agree. So what would be the best place to live if you were to drop yourself down from a space capsule on somewhere on the planet? Where would you like to land? Well, I don't know about you, but I might like to land in either Hawaii or San Diego, where there's lots of shade, lots of sun, lots of food growing, green plants, coconut trees with coconuts falling on the ground and so forth, lots of fish. So our starting point is that in order for a human being to be happy and whole, we have to have a nice environment. Safe environment with clean air, clean water, clean food, and a place to sleep that's safe. Place we feel safe and accepted, and most importantly, in the context of this talk, most importantly, sunlight, full spectrum sunlight. That's how we evolved. A lot of people don't realize this, but it's becoming more and more mainstream that light is actually a nutrient. Just like vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin D, vitamin A. For example, if you don't get any vitamin D, your bones will get rickets. So then if you give people small amounts of vitamin D, like 200 IUs per day, they won't have rickets, but they might still have weakened immune systems. So we know now that we really need about 10,000 IUs of vitamin D per day. That's just one example of why the sun's important, because vitamin D comes from the sun. Dr. Wunsch is one of the leading authorities on light in the world, and he showed in one of his videos a graph that shows on the x-axis UV, visible, infrared, and there's mid, near, and far, and then these are microwaves out here. Cell phones and everything. So these are bad. So what Wunsch showed in his graph was that there was all these bodily chemical reactions that took up space on this graph, and it turns out that every frequency is needed for some biological process. For example, UVA and B. For UVB, there was a little line that was for making vitamin D from the sun, right? And then there's reactions in the green area, the red area, orange, yellow, green, blue. This is the most aggressive wave. This is the most gentle wave in the visible spectrum. So your eyes. So I'll refer back to this graph. But there's a lot of chemical reactions. And you need these light waves just like you need, for example, nutrients such as omega-3s from fish oil, because our body doesn't produce them. So we need fish oil and we need light from the sun. And not just a few frequencies, but all the frequencies. And not just the visible, but we need some UVB and we need a bunch of IR, infrared. Turns out the near infrared region, sorry, this is near, right here. This is mid. So some frequencies in the near infrared don't really heat us up as much as out here in the mid. For example, 810 nanometers of the infrared is a very important frequency which activates our mitochondria that reside inside of every cell in our body. And it's absolutely necessary for our mitochondria to work properly, to get that infrared frequency at 810 nanometers. Now, that light wave activates the cytochrome C oxidase molecule. It's a chromophore inside the mitochondria that absorbs certain wavelengths. So that chromophore absorbs two peaks, one at 810 and one in the red at 660 nanometers. So when light hits the chromophore in our mitochondria, cytochrome C oxidase, it reacts to form in a complicated reaction ATP, which is the energy that all people need to feel good, to feel energetic and healthy. Every cell needs ATP. It's the fuel that runs our entire body, and it's in every single cell. Dr. Hamblin also pointed out that the wavelength doesn't have to be exactly 660 and 810. It can be anywhere in the mid-600s in terms of nanometers of wavelength of light, and also anywhere in the low 800s of light. Every single frequency of the full spectrum sunlight is on this graph, and I have just now given one example, but there's many, many more examples. That one example being mitochondria. So I hope this alone has convinced you that you need full spectrum sunlight. I want to take a moment to look again at the spectrum and remind you that I pointed out that there's a red and a near infrared frequency that activates the chromophores in the mitochondria, the cytochrome C oxidase chromophore, and that in turn allows the mitochondria to properly produce ATP, which runs every cell in our body. It's the energy source of life. And there's two more things that the infrared light gives to the body, and why infrared light is a nutrient, and why we shouldn't be taking it away from our natural lighting that we live in every day. The near, mid, and far infrared rays. One of those is nitric oxide, often abbreviated as NO in scientists' papers. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator that's used throughout the body to determine where the blood will flow. For example, if you have your hand in the sun and you begin to receive infrared rays from the sun, you might feel a wonderful, warm, tingly feeling of bliss. And that is the nitric oxide that is causing your constricted capillaries to open up and be bigger capillaries, so that before the blood couldn't get through, but now it can, because it's dilated. And so your microcapillaries begin to allow the blood to flow more freely. Or say if you're in a fight or flight response and you feel that your hands are very cold, that's normal, because your body is not having nitric oxide in your hands, and it's causing the blood to go to your major organs so that if you lose a limb, you'll still survive. Now, and when you meditate, you send a message to your hands for you that you're safe, and then you form nitric oxide in your hands, and your hands become warm. So that's why one of the solutions to Raynaud's syndrome is to do biofeedback and learn how to meditate and cause your hands to be warm, because it takes away the fear sensation, for example, and allows you to relax, feel safe, and then your body tells the nitric oxide to be formed in your hands and you get more warm blood flowing through it. So this is very, very important. The other very important thing that infrared does, and this is so important that I'm going to draw a picture of water. So this is the oxygen molecule, O for oxygen, and then these are the two hydrogens. And when you shine certain photonic energy packets onto water, it will only absorb certain ones. And it turns out that water absorbs very heavily in the infrared range. And the infrared causes the water very gentle movement. And so, for example, this hydrogen will bounce in and out. This hydrogen will bounce in and out. Or it might be that they bounce in and out symmetrically or asymmetrically. And then also the water molecule might twist a bit, like twist, twist, twist. And those gentle forms of the water molecule jiggling allows the nutrients to go through, for example, the cytoplasm of the cell, which is an aqueous solution. If you've got a lot of water molecules and they're all jiggling, it's a lot easier for the nutrient to make it through the water molecule to where it's trying to go. If you don't have infrared rays so that they gently jiggle in this special way, it's not a way where you feel heat. It's just a way that the water molecules are awake. It's like lubricating the joints of the water molecule so that it's in there and it's jiggling around, and that way it's not like ice. It's not like, okay, so normally water molecules are all hydrogen bonded to each other to form giant clusters. Well, some wavelengths in the infrared, especially the far infrared, tend to break these clusters up, and that's a good thing because then the water molecules aren't bound to each other, and so you have more routes to get for your nutrient to get through the cell and into its destination. For example, if you're taking a nutrient to the nucleus of the cell, you have to be able to enter the channel and go through to the nucleus. So I'll also say that microwave radiation does something different to the water. You're cycling it, positive, negative, so that the water molecule gets confused and it twists and it keeps trying to reorient into the field. And so you have these water molecules doing this very harsh, unnatural movement. And so that's actually an unhealthy thing for your cell. But just to have the water molecule, kind of jiggling around gently to where, like I say, you don't feel heat from it necessarily. I mean, what happens is you get better nutrients in and then toxins out. So that's a very important part of infrared rays. So you have three things then. You have ATP production, you have vasodilation, nitric oxide, and blood flow regulation, and then you also have the water becoming a much better solvent so that you have better transport of nutrients in and out of the cell. So I wanted to point that out before we move on to the next topic. I want to shift to what the human being experiences evolutionarily, like how did we evolve in terms of our relationship to full spectrum sunlight. Well, before we delve into the talk, I wanted to just remind you of a couple things. One is that the blue is the most aggressive of the visible light. And by aggressive, what I mean is when blue light, for example, hits a cell, it starts to make free radicals. And free radicals are just basically breaking up whatever molecule it sees, whether it's a DNA molecule or other useful cellular components. It's like shooting bullets into your cell. And so those blue light waves have a certain photonic energy that tends to be absorbed by a lot of the bonds in your molecular structure of your cells. So it's not like we don't want blue, but we need to be aware of this so that we can then understand why, when we're being bombarded with blue light waves, we also need the healing ray, which is the ray that repairs the damage that the blue does. Here's the red right here, and as it turns out, the wavelengths that do the repair and regeneration of our cells, especially when they've been bombarded with blue, is the 660 nanometers and the 810 nanometers in our mitochondria. And so whenever we're bombarded with blue, we also need to be bombarded with red and near infrared, and in particular at 660 and 810, because those heal our cells and to repair the damage done by the blue light. Now, now that I've pointed that out, I'd like to mention one other thing about blue light. Blue light is normally when we wake up in the morning and at noon, and then later in the day there's less blue light and more red. As you know, sunsets are usually red. So that's the natural change of the spectrum throughout the day that our body has evolved with. And what happens is, in the morning when you get your first hint of blue light, it tells the body to wake up. How does it do that? Well, when there's a certain retinal pathway in your eye that's actually just been discovered recently, I'm guessing in the last 10 years, maybe more recently than that, maybe in the last 5, and that retinal pathway, when it sees blue, it shuts down the production of melatonin, which you need at night to sleep, and it tells it that it's time to wake up and to be active. Okay, just to simplify it. So we do need blue light, and in fact, our circadian rhythms when you travel can actually be adjusted by adjusting when you get your sunlight, your blue light from the sun. So it's definitely a nutrient, as are all the colors, as are the UV and the infrared, all nutrients. So now that you know the background about the blue and the red, I'll say one more thing before we delve into our daily spectrum change of the sunlight, and that is that at nighttime, we need melatonin, and the only way the body can make melatonin is in perfect darkness. So the way we evolved is at night we would only have amber, which has no blue light in it at all, and that amber comes from like fire, like torches. So in the last million years at night, that's all we used to have. So we are able to sleep with firelight, but not with blue light. And firelight is the amber and the red spectrum end of the light over here. Okay, and when it's either firelight or preferably even complete darkness, which is even more healthy, absolutely there's nothing stopping the melatonin from being formed. And so then what happens is that our serotonin, which is normally present during the day when there's blue light, that serotonin in perfect darkness or in amber light is converted into melatonin. And melatonin does several things when you sleep. One, it helps you sleep deeply and it makes you very relaxed and sleepy. And two, it allows the body to go into low energy, low metabolism. In other words, the ATP is not being formed at night as much. So you're in a low metabolism state. Your mitochondria are like they're asleep. And then all your energy stores go instead into repair of all the damage that happened during the day. Also at night, while that's happening, you're rearranging all the informational data that's come in through the day, and you're reprocessing it and storing it properly. I like to say that you store it in your pensieve, and if you don't do this at night and the next day you wake up, your mind is scattered and you've got too much information in there and it hasn't been properly compartmentalized. So that's why sleep allows you to learn better, because at night, that's kind of when the learning takes place and everything's stored in long-term memory that happened during the day. And then it clears your mind for a fresh slate for the next day. That's the way I like to think about it. So now that we've talked about kind of those fundamentals, I'm going to use this whiteboard to draw some of the spectrums that we see during the day. And we'll start with in the morning. In the morning, our spectrum is, if this is blue, green, and red, let's see, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and then I guess I'll say violet. It's really just blue. Violet is actually red and blue together, but we're just going to say that for purposes of our discussion so that it's the full rainbow. And then we have the UV and the infrared. So this is the spectrum that gives us human health. And in the morning, what we'll see is, well, first of all, when the sun just comes up over the edge, it's more red because the blue light is scattered when the, here's the atmosphere, and when the sun, and here's you right here. And so when the sun's coming up and it hits the angle of the earth and there's a long distance for it to go through the air before it reaches you, that is going to cause the blue light to scatter more than the red so that you get more red to your eyes. So in the morning light we get more red, but pretty soon the sun's up here, and what happens is that the spectrum is more like this. Okay, and you notice you have a lot of blue up here, and that tells you it's time to wake up, shut off that melatonin, you know, don't be sleepy anymore. And before it becomes blue, and there's a lot of red light when the sun was down here, that spectrum is more like this, to where there's proportionally more red light. What happens is that red and infrared, and in particular the 660 and the 810 wavelengths of light, earlier I said frequency and I actually meant wavelengths. You can convert these to frequency, but most people that are in the light business, they talk about light in terms of the wavelengths because it's kind of easy to remember. You know, it's a distance that the wave of the light, like if you draw the wave, it's the distance that the single wave pulse has. That's the distance. And then that little wave pulse travels in time at the speed of light. So that distance is what we're talking about when we talk about wavelengths. Now, so in the early morning when you get mostly red, what that does is it starts to wake up your mitochondria, because those are the two things. Remember I said that the chromophore in the mitochondria in every cell of your body has two peaks where it absorbs. That's here and here, the chromophore, that is being cytochrome C oxidase. It absorbs at 660 and 810. So the red light and the infrared light in the morning sun activates that, wakes up the mitochondria, and starts to produce ATP, which is the energy that runs everything we do and think and say and feel. So, but then the blue comes, and that's also linked, or the body believes, and rightly so, that the more blue there is, the more UV. For example, at noon it's more like that, and so we judge how much UV is in the air by how much blue goes into our eyes and our skin. So the blue is our signal that it's UV, you know, and that we want to get out of the light and go into the shade. So normally people will go out in the morning and it feels really good, and then as the sun gets higher and higher, wow, that blue light is so strong, and then they go in, you know, maybe take a nap. It just, of course, depends on where you are in the world. And then, but this would be like in San Diego. And then in the afternoon when the blue spectrum goes away a little bit and it gets a little bit less intense and your skin burns less, then you will have more of a curve like this, and you'll have less blue. So in the morning, I mentioned that the red activates your mitochondria and starts to wake you up. Then the blue comes in and tells you to be awake and set your circadian rhythm so that it knows when you'll be going to sleep that night and so forth. And when you do go outside, there's a UVB. Now, remember I told you there's chemical reactions that your body needs all the wavelengths, but we'll focus on a few of the more common ones. The UVA is right here, and the UVB is an even higher energy, which corresponds to a shorter wavelength, and that's up here, and this makes vitamin D. So vitamin D, about 15 minutes at high noon, like if you can't get out in the sun all day and you want to get maximum vitamin D formation, you would go out in the sun at high noon, because that's when the ratio of UVB is higher than UVA. Or it's not higher, but the ratio is the max. So because you want to get more UVB in your 10 minutes that you go out. You know, you want to maximize the UVB, you would go out at high noon. That's when UVB is the strongest. We need to go outside in the sun to get our vitamin D. And it is true that nowadays we all just take vitamins. But there's a lot of controversy as to are vitamins really getting in the right places in our body? Or do we need sun-based vitamin D in our body? And some people believe, some really smart people believe that we actually need the sun because the vitamins don't get into the right places of our body. But natural is probably always the best. So then at later in the day, as the sun starts to go down, it becomes more red again. And remember I said that blue and UV damages when you go out there, but it's really not damage if you can get the later rays from the day, like the more red shifted spectrum. So this might be the sunset spectrum. Sunset, and then this would be noon. Okay, so the sunset spectrum has less, and like not much UV at all, because again, it's all bent away. All the high energy waves are scattered, and only the low energy red and infrared waves come through. Those act to repair any damage that was done earlier in the day from both the UV and the blue. So that's the time where you regenerate and restore, is later in the day when you have this spectrum. And I'll say one more point, is back at noon when you are getting the blue and you are getting the UV, they have a purpose and they do both damage and good, but they're repaired later in the day. But they're also being repaired while you're in that blue, because when you're getting that blue, you're also always getting the red and the infrared. It's never missing. Now later when we talk about our current society and the current lighting that's used in buildings, you'll find that the infrared is completely missing and the red is at a very low level. And so you're not getting any of these regenerative light waves. You're bombarding your eyes with blue light, and it's constantly like bullets breaking the cell up. And let's look at your cell. Here's your cell, and here's a mitochondria. And what happens normally is the free radicals that are formed from light hitting the cell, and also especially blue makes the most free radicals, red makes the least. So anyway, let's talk about light going in. Normally, the free radicals are generated around the edge of the mitochondria, and that's where the cell expects to find it. But when you have blue with no infrared there to counteract the damage in real time, then what happens is you get free radicals in all these weird places out here, and they build up. And so then at night, like say if you have an electrical appliance that gives you red light, it's not as easy for the red light to come in and repair this. It can only repair this. So where the free radicals are formed is an important thing. I hope that makes sense. So now we've talked about the different spectrums of the day, and at night we get the red for regenerative. And then the firelight is, I'll draw another spectrum, same colors. Okay, so here's IR and here's UV. Okay, so the firelight is just in here. Okay, right? So we get a lot of infrared from the fire, and then we've got the yellow and the orange and the red, and that's the amber, and that's from fire at night because there's no blue light going through that retinal pathway. So at night, if you have a little amber night light, you plug into the wall, that is not, or red, that won't wake you up. And another thing you can do at night is, by the way, I'll just show you that right here, is wear these. And probably, I do this in addition. These don't fit over my current glasses, but I don't need glasses at night. I just wear these, and they're not really that dark, so you can really see where you're going. It just cuts out 100% of the blue. When you sleep, there's absolutely no light. That's what you want. You want zero light. And that way you can sleep very, very soundly. And what happens when you sleep? You rejuvenate your cells and you repair, and your mitochondria goes to sleep too. Okay, that's the mitochondria in your cells. It's asleep, you're asleep, and all your thoughts are going into your pensive, right? That pensive in Harry Potter, all your thoughts are going in there, and they're, basically your long-term memory is being stored. And so you wake up with a fresh mind and optimism and everything. And then your mitochondria goes to sleep so that the energy can go into repairing broken strands of DNA. There's a good strand, that's a broken strand. Anyway, so then when the sun rises and there's that blue light again, it tells you to wake up. And then the mitochondria always start to wake up, because the very first rays of red light activate the chromophores with these two wavelengths, the cytochrome C oxidase chromophores in the mitochondria in your cell. So that would be the sort of the summary of what happens during the day and the night cycle of a human being in symbiosis with full spectrum sunlight, all the happenings that go along with the sun rising and setting. So now let's turn the page. Ta-da! Turn the page. And now we're going to talk about how we live today and how does that compare with how we evolved and what's wrong and how we can fix it. So I'm going to use this again to talk about the different spectrums of light. So I'm going to draw sunlight at the very top, just as a reference. So here's the sunlight, okay, and we've got your UV, visible. I like to do this for the visible because it's, visual. And then here's your infrared, and then this would be like near infrared, mid infrared, and far infrared, okay? Now, so that's the sunlight, okay? Now, back in the early 1900s, we had incandescent bulbs, and that is caused by electrically heating a filament, which does sort of the same thing that sun does. And I'm not going into too much detail, like in reality, the clouds in the atmosphere filter out certain frequencies. So your sunlight, you've really got something going on like this. But for the most part, comparing to the other light bulbs, it's pretty much full spectrum. And then the incandescent light spectrum, if that's the sunlight, notice this is the blue. Okay, it's got a lot less blue. It's got no UV and it's got less blue, and it's more like this. So pretty similar, isn't it? Because it's this very similar mechanism to where it's black body radiation from a very hot filament, and the sun is black body radiation from a very hot body. And so because of the kinetic movement of all the molecules in the sun and in the incandescent filament, it makes a spectrum called Planck's black body radiation, and that's the Planck distribution of light waves. Now, we tried to save energy by going to fluorescence. And what kind of spectrum would you think fluorescence have? Well, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm just a little bit visual, and here's what I remember. Is that there's like a blue, and there's a couple here, and there's a few here, but it's mostly missing a lot, and there's not much red. It's just, how fluorescents are really blue, and, really high in the blue spectrum. So, yeah, that's kind of what fluorescents look like. And you can go online and look at anyone will tell you that's what you need to know. But the main thing you need to know about fluorescence is, okay, my scale is weird. Yeah. Let's start over on the fluorescence. I thought that was all visible, but we have to realize that this is the visible part. So anyway, yeah, fluorescence has a big blue peak and a few other peaks, blah, 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 and no infrared at all. okay? And it might even have some UV in there. Some, fluorescent bulbs do have UV. I don't really know how much. They say it's not much, but I think it's enough to damage. Okay, but the main thing is blue. All right? And fluorescents have several things going against them. One is that you're missing some colors. You're missing the healing infrared. And you want infrared, but you're missing it, so that gives a minus. You're missing it. And there's another thing, is that it's 60, 100, or 200 hertz. Okay, so it flickers on, off, and it's like a smooth curve. Like it gradually turns on, and then it gradually turns off, and gradually turns on, and it gradually turns off. And that flicker curve, if you looked at it on an oscilloscope, it would be like this, like a sine wave. That flicker, when your eye sees it, the pupil reacts by, you know how when someone shines a flashlight in your eye and your pupil gets real small? Well, that's what happens with the light. When it turns on, your light, your pupil shrinks to protect itself from too much light. And then when it turns off, it gets bigger and bigger. And then it turns on, smaller, off, bigger. And so your eye, your pupil is vibrating. And this has been measured with cameras looking at the eye at high-speed photography. They've seen that our pupils are vibrating with the flicker rate of the bulb. And so when you think about it, that would give anybody a piercing headache. And I do personally notice that when I walk into a room with flickers, my left eye will usually have a sharp pain in it. And that's because it's probably very sensitive to the flicker. And the low-hanging fluorescent lights in offices that don't have the really, really high ceilings are even worse because they're closer to your eye, and they're causing your pupil to vibrate in terms of getting bigger and smaller. And most of those tube lights that we're exposed to are not at the high flicker rate that some claim, oh, fluorescents have improved now. Well, it is true that some fluorescents can vibrate at very high frequencies, but I can guarantee you that it's probably not going to be the cheap tube lights that you see when you walk around. The compact fluorescents will probably have varying flicker rates. But there's one more thing that's negative about the fluorescent lights, and that is a really, really bad thing. It might even be the worst thing ever, which would end up making LEDs better than fluorescents, even though LEDs are bad too, is that it has mercury in it. And I don't even mean that when you drop the bulb, the mercury goes into it. That's a bad enough problem as it is. And I'll just say that, like in Europe, they have mercury drills where if someone drops a light bulb, the whole classroom has to run outside because it's such a bad thing. So that alone would make you not want to use CFCs or any mercury-filled light bulb, which is what fluorescents are. But the really bad thing about mercury is that if you have, let's just draw a tube bulb, and there's a mercury molecule in there, which there is, and you are activating it with electricity, right? Electrons in, electrons out, and you're activating it. What is happening to that mercury atom? Well, it's got orbitals. Let's do it the old-fashioned way, the Bohr way, where he draws an orbital of an electron going around the mercury. And what happens is, that's just an easy way to visualize the orbitals. What happens is it goes to a higher orbital. That electron, when it's excited with an electrical current going through it, it jumps to a higher orbital, and then it's not stable, so then it jumps back to either that orbital or some other orbital, and it releases a photon. And that photon has a certain specific wavelength that's specific to the mercury molecule, and all the different orbital changes in the mercury produce what's called a fingerprint of wavelengths of light that correspond to that mercury. That's how they identify elements in stars, is they look for these fingerprints. And if you have a certain grouping of photonic wavelengths that corresponds to the mercury orbitals, and in particular the electrons popping between those orbitals, and then when they go down to a lower orbital they release a photon, that gives you a fingerprint of photons that identifies that mercury. Okay, so now let's just say, and there's a mercury molecule inside my body, and it's getting flooded with fluorescent light. What does it see? It sees the spectrum of mercury, and that excites those mercury atoms in your body, just like it excites them in the light bulb. Just, because these are excited and they're exciting the mercury in your body. So they're activating all the mercury that's in your body, whether it's from vaccinations or from, breathing pollution, or just in, just in the common pollution or your fillings that it gets into your saliva every day and you swallow, and it builds up in your body. All those molecules are getting activated, and it can't be a good thing because it's just making it be more toxic than it already is. So that's a huge thing. And then finally, we're going to draw a plot of the LED spectrum. And the LED spectrum is very easy. You have a big blue spectrum, blue, and then you have a medium green spectrum, and then you have a wee little red spectrum, and you have no IR, no healing infrared, you have no, now you have missing colors. So just like here, we're repeating these two, okay, and then you also have flicker, and I'm going to say that the flicker of LEDs is worse than the flicker of fluorescence, because fluorescence, as you remember, has a sine wave. See the sine wave that it flickers on off very gently? But the flicker of LEDs, and the way the flicker is generated is called pulse width modulation. And to do that, they pulse the energy, and what you get is you get an abrupt on peak and an abrupt off peak. Abrupt on, abrupt off. And a lot of the LEDs are only about 100 cycles per second, or maybe at the most 200. There are some high-tech ones that go up into the thousands, but they're very rare and hard to find. There are some computers that have the high flicker rate, and I want to talk about flicker rate. There's two things wrong with the LED flicker. One is that it's so abrupt that, remember when I talked about when the fluorescent goes on and off, your pupil goes big, little, big, little? Well, think about it. This is like bullets, it's like very aggressive. It's not just gently turning on the stream of photons, but it's like you get a blast of photons. You get no photons, and then all of a sudden you get a wall of photons hitting your eyes. And then all of a sudden they just stop. And then another blast, and then they stop. So it would be kind of like a gentle shower head of photons versus a very harsh on-off shower head of photons into your eye. And so what that does is it makes your pupil even more vibratory and, I guess, uncomfortably forced to open and close. And so that would give an even more, a vigorous headache, And it's not just your eyes, it's also your skin that has to subsist in this environment. And then back to the spectrum, we've got an inordinate amount of blue light, and it turns out that our perception of color is okay when you add just a little bit of extra red, and those are called the warm LEDs. But there's still a problem with the warm LEDs. They may seem more okay to our eyes because our eyes, we have red, green, and blue cone cells. And so the way they've discovered that they can fool you into thinking you have full spectrum light is by supplying single wavelength blue in very high amounts, single wavelength green, and single wavelength red. And it gives you the perception of full spectrum light. But your body is missing these colors, and it's also missing all the infrared. And it also gives very poor color rendering, even though it might seem on first glance that it's okay. But since you're missing all the colors in the middle, you've got poor color rendering there. And see, what else would I want to say about LEDs? The flicker rate. Yes, I was saying there's some maybe expensive ones that do flicker at a high rate, and I just want to talk about flicker rate. It's been proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that when you are bombarded with flickering lights, and you are, let's just say you're reading a computer screen, and your eyes are going back and forth, and you're reading. Normally, we read pretty fast. We're trained to read fast. But if your computer flickers at 100 or 200 cycles per second, whether it's fluorescent or LED, you'll see a flicker. And maybe some people can't and some people can, because we're all different and we all have different thresholds of our perception. But another way people test it is, if you're looking at monitors and you want to see if they flicker, you hold your hand like this, and if you see kind of a flickering movement, then you know it's flickering. There's different ways to test it. Also, the iPhone, I believe 6 and beyond, has a slow motion video camera, and you can video the monitor that you want to buy or the one you own, and if it flickers, then you'll know that your computer flickers, because the frame rate of the phone is so fast that it can actually pick up the flicker, and your video, when you play it slow, you'll actually see it go on and off. So the eye can detect it up to 1600 cycles per second, or 1600 hertz. That's a huge number, and almost everything is in the hundreds, not in the thousands, in terms of flicker rate. I think there's some society of lighting that recommends 2000 or higher hertz for lights so that your eyes will be comfortable. Andrew Wunsch believes that it should be 10,000 or higher, maybe even 20,000 or higher, because a lot of sensitive individuals can still detect flicker, and it may not even be in your eye, but it may be your cells can detect it, and it'll give you a sense of unease or uncomfortableness, just a general bad mood or bad feeling. There's a word for that. It's a new word. I just learned it, and I'll try to remember to put it in the notes below, but it's something like neurothesia or something. It's the word that stands for just generally feeling bad for no known reason. But like, for example, I can think of things that make me feel bad, and I don't know why I'm feeling bad until after I relieve myself. One is, it used to be being in fluorescent lights, and I would always notice that when I went outdoors I would feel better, and so I finally figured out it was fluorescent lights. Another thing is, have you ever there's no bathroom break, and you're sitting in a seminar, and you've been going for 4 hours, and you don't even realize that you have to, go to the restroom, but you really do. And then when you finally go, it's like, you just feel so much better. So there's all these things that make us feel good, and we're not necessarily always aware of why we feel bad. And so that's part of why I want to share this with you, because if you want to have a better mood and be more productive, you might want to consider the benefits of full spectrum sunlight and working next to a window or with incandescents, and avoiding the fluorescence and the LEDs, because these might be making you feel bad and you're not realizing why. So that's going to then take me, again, turn the page again to the next and the final section of this talk, where I talk about what the things we can do now and maybe consider for our future of humanity, what we want to do to make our lives more productive and more enjoyable, to where it's worth doing what we got our degrees in college to do, or what we have passion for. We don't want to go get our degrees and have passion for doing science or whatever it is you want to do, and then have to do it in fluorescence and then just never feel good. So what I do is, in the morning and noon and afternoon, I try to get as much sun as possible, even if it's just walking to my car or timing my errands during the day when it's sunny, and not doing them at night. And also minimizing my time in stores that have the fluorescence, which is pretty much every store. I have a black visor that I wear, and I have some amber glasses that I always put on before I go into a store with fluorescence. and it makes a huge difference. Now, I realize it doesn't get rid of the flicker, but it does get rid of the blue portion of the flicker, and that seems to make a huge difference for me. I still don't feel that happy when I'm in the stores, but I don't get a headache. If I have a hat on and this, and preferably a thick jacket, because that prevents any light from getting through to your body. So, I mean, that's just personally what I do. Everybody has to find what works for them, what you're more comfortable with, and then when I come out of the store, I, put on my regular glasses. And I also like to spend as much time in the sun as possible without any glasses at all, because I believe that we need unfiltered light into our eyes, and the glasses filter out some of the infrared as well as some of the colors, as well as a lot of the UV. So I'm just saying, you don't want to stare at the sun or anything, but I like to have, maybe 10 minutes a day. I wish I could have more where I'm just not protected with the glasses. I believe that we need all the ambient light, the black body radiation coming from all the ambient things around us to go to our body and not have our eyes always blocked. It can't be a good thing to always have those there. And sometimes when I'm working on the computer and I can't have it dimmed, like say I'm working on an art project and I have to really look at the colors, at least I'll wear a 10% amber tint, and this tends to not interfere with the colors at all, but it just gently reduces the blue, similar to blue blocking eyeglasses. And maybe it reduces some of the blue, but not enough to completely prevent the damage. But it's just a milder form of protection. And at home, when I'm not using any computers, I use my regular glasses. Now, I also have two screens, which are black and white. They're e-paper screens. One is a Kindle, which I use for reading books when I travel, rather than reading them on my cell phone, which is, of course, backlit LED. So I use the e-ink screens. And then now there's a new screen, 13-inch screen that is able to be linked to your computer, and it's called Boox, B-O-O-X. It's very expensive. The 13-inch screen is about this big, and maybe about an inch smaller this way. Anyway, no, it's not quite that big. Sorry. Yeah, it's more like 13 inches, so it's about to here. So there and there. Anyway, it's big enough to be able to read PDF files, and I use it when I'm, say, editing, not typing a lot, but editing a manuscript. I found that the only problem is that my mouse moves quite slowly, but if I'm really impatient and I'm doing a lot of mouse clicks, I'll look over at the other screen. I realize this is a lot of work, and you probably don't want to do that. But since I'm very, very sensitive, and I'm just thrilled that they finally have a black and white screen to use, I'm going to put up with it, and I'm actually getting pretty used to it, and that now I accept it, and it doesn't bother me at all. At first it was a little irritating, but now since I'm used to it, it's really nice, and I find that my eyes just don't hurt because it's like looking at paper. You can actually watch videos on the book screen as well. It's just that the videos have to be videos like this one where people are talking and maybe showing graphs. If it's a high action film, forget it, because the frame rate is just way too low. Thank you very much, and I really love this field, and I want to help you not get eye damage. I didn't really mention that high levels of blue cause macular degeneration, and the macula is the portion of the retina that's right in the middle. That's where all the cone cells are concentrated. The cone cells are the color cells, and so if you're looking at, say, a piece of art and you're staring at a little dot and you're looking at the detail of the paint, that's your macula. And if that's damaged, then when you look at a page with letters or art or something, you want to see the detail, it'll all be grayed. And that's macular degeneration. And we don't want that to happen, but it's becoming rampant in our society. And all the elderly people that I know have it, and they have found that it's caused by looking at computer screens and using LEDs. And that's just proof that the blue light from, the high energy blue light from the LEDs right here is causing your macula in your retina, the high detail part of your retina that sees details to generate a lot of free radicals, and there's no infrared in that light to help repair it. Couple that with the fact that the retina itself, the macula in particular, have the least amount of blood vessels compared to any other organ in your entire body. So the blood vessels in the retina and the macula in particular are very far spaced apart, and so it's really hard to get nutrients in and toxins out of that region. So that is going to be the first place that the blue light will do damage, because it's the hardest to regenerate. So that's just all the more reason why you should protect yourself from excess amounts of blue light and get as much natural sunlight as possible, which has the infrared. There are infrared products out there that are made from LEDs that are at the 660 and the 810 wavelengths that I said were healthy, and they're over here in the near infrared, and that's the rejuvenating wavelengths that activate this cytochrome C oxidase chromophores in our mitochondria that produce ATP. And so a lot of people that live in climates that have no sun, like say all winter, like in up north, mostly in the winter, like say in the West Coast in Seattle, I mean it's just cloudy all the time, so they might want to use these products, and that would be make sure it doesn't flicker. So it's just it's not using pulse width modulation. It would be the red LED and the near infrared LEDs that are just always on with no pulse width modulation, and then you can apply them to different parts in your body. Some people put them on their head to prevent Alzheimer's, and also even to cure Alzheimer's. That's relatively new, but that may be the new way that we treat Alzheimer's, is to put the mitochondria rejuvenating wavelengths into the places that are hurting because we aren't exposing ourselves to natural sunlight. So I have a small pad about this big that has rows of the 660 red and the 810 near infrared in it, and I apply it like if I have right now I have a sore hand from overuse of the guitar, and then sometimes my knees get hurt, and I use it there, and my lower back or my kidneys, or wherever I have an ache, and I put it there, it does always feel better. And so I've been using that for about a year, and it's just a good thing to have. I think all people should have one of those pads so that they can treat their body whenever it's hurting, and then it helps the mitochondria to produce ATP, which is what that local part of your body needs in order to heal whatever has happened to it. It's just the repair mechanism, and you need ATP for that. So I've talked about humans evolving in the natural sunlight, and then I've talked about all the different some examples of biochemical reactions that we use with the full spectrum sunlight in order to symbiotically exist with the sun happily. And then I've talked about how technology has given us artificial light spectrum that's basically taken away the nutrients that we need. And then I closed by saying what you can do to protect yourself from this technology. And I'll close by saying that if there was any one thing I think you could do to help your health, it would be to get a pair of these blue blockers for nighttime use. Because for $50, if you can block the blue and get your melatonin production up at night and get good sleep, that'll go a very, very long way in ensuring that you have a happy and a healthy life, because that'll allow your brain to be healthy, your body to have the repair and rejuvenation mechanism that it needs at night so that you can have a good day. It also keeps your metabolism balanced, and just almost every single disease is prevented or helped heal by getting proper sleep. So that would be my number one recommendation. And then two is try to keep out of or protect yourself from the flickering lights from fluorescent tube lamps. Don't buy CFCs in your home or LEDs unless it's just to light the garage and you hardly ever go in there. And if you're sensitive, don't even put LEDs in your garage, because, for example, when I go into a garage with LEDs, I do feel quite bad. So I have to really protect myself, and if people have LEDs in their homes, I really can't go in them. Now, I'm an exception. I'm not saying that you would be that way. If I could go in there, I certainly would, because I think friendship and celebrating dinner with your friends is much more important than staying out of the lights. But if it gives me a headache, then I literally can't do it. So that's one of the reasons, I guess, why I'm in this field, because I have a passion to understand it and to protect myself from it, and then hopefully I can help you. So thank you for listening. I hope it's helped you. If you like my channel, I would love it if you subscribe and comment and like and ask questions, and we can all learn together. Thank you so much. And the music that I use on my channels is my own, because I don't want to step on anyone's copyright. So you may like it, you may not like it, but it is copyright free. So thanks for listening, and until next time, peace everybody. Can you lend a helping hand to those in need?